You know what finally made me a better woodworker? It wasn't a new table saw. It wasn't a fancy jig I saw online. It was a beat-up blanket chest sitting in the back of an antique shop in eastern Kentucky. The thing was built sometime around 1840, and I couldn't believe how tight the joints still were. No screws, no modern glue, just hand-cut dovetails and solid white oak, holding together after almost 200 years. I stood there looking at it thinking, whoever built this didn't have a YouTube channel. He didn't have a thickness planer or a digital caliper. He had an axe, a few hand planes, and a set of rules that he followed like gospel. And that's when I started digging into what those rules actually were. Today, I'm going to walk you through 10 woodworking rules that frontier craftsmen lived by. Rules that most of us have either forgotten or never learned in the first place. And if you stick around to the end, I've got a bonus tip about a grain reading trick I picked up from studying pioneer-era furniture that completely changed how I lay out my cuts. Let's get into it. The American frontier produced some of the most practical, durable woodworking this country has ever seen. And the men and women who built it didn't have room for error. Every board was hard-won, every tool was precious, and every project had to last. The rules they followed weren't suggestions, they were survival. And the incredible thing is, those same rules will make your work better today than any tool upgrade ever could. To understand why these rules matter so much, you have to understand the world these people were working in. From the late 1700s through the middle of the 1800s, settlers pushing into Appalachia, the Ohio Valley, and beyond were building everything they needed from the timber around them. Cabins, furniture, wagons, fence posts, barn frames, tool handles, even eating utensils. They were working with white oak, black walnut, tulip, poplar, eastern white pine, hickory, and whatever else grew within dragging distance of their home site. Their toolkit was minimal by our standards. A felling axe, a broad axe for hewing, a froe and mallet for riving, a draw knife, maybe a couple of wooden-bodied planes, a handsaw, and a set of chisels if they were lucky. No electricity, no sandpaper, no hardware store down the road. And here's the thing that really struck me when I started studying this period. The furniture and structures that survived from this era didn't survive by accident. They survived because the people who built them understood wood at a level most of us never reach. They couldn't afford to get it wrong. If a chair failed in January, you were sitting on the floor until spring. If a cabin wall warped, you were patching gaps in a snowstorm. So they developed rules. Simple, clear, non-negotiable rules that governed every decision in the workshop. And when I started applying those rules in my own shop, the difference was immediate. The first rule is one you've probably heard your whole life, but I don't think most of us really understand what it originally meant. Always read the grain before you cut. For a pioneer, this wasn't just about getting a cleaner surface with a hand plane. When you're riving boards with a froe, which means splitting them along the grain rather than sawing them, the grain direction is everything. A straight-grained piece of white oak will rive clean and true. A piece with interlocking or swirling grain will fight you and give you a twisted, useless board. So before they ever swung an axe, they'd study the log. They'd look at the bark patterns, check the end grain, even flex a small split piece to see how the fibers ran. In your shop, this translates directly. Before you run a board through the planer, before you make your first cut, take 30 seconds and really look at the grain. Figure out which direction the fibers are running. It'll tell you which way to plane, which face to show, and where the board is likely to move. 30 seconds of reading saves hours of frustration. The second rule is the one everybody knows. Measure twice, cut once. But on the frontier, this wasn't a cute saying you'd put on a shop sign. It was about the fact that every single board represented hours of backbreaking labor. You felled the tree, you limbed it, you bucked it into lengths, you split or hewed it into boards, you let it season. If you made a bad cut at the end of all that work, you didn't just waste a $3 board from the lumberyard, you wasted days of your life. That weight behind the saying is what made it a rule and not a suggestion. And I'll tell you, once I started treating every board in my shop like it took me 2 days to make by hand, my cut accuracy went up dramatically. Not because I got more skilled, because I started paying more attention. The third rule is one that a lot of modern woodworkers skip, and it costs them. Never build joinery with green wood unless you account for the shrinkage. Pioneer craftsmen understood wood moisture better than most of us do, even with our fancy moisture meters. They knew that a freshly felled white oak board might be at 30% moisture content, and that by the time it air-dried under a shed for a year, it would be down to around 12 to 15%. That's a huge amount of movement, so they had strict habits around this. Structural timbers for a cabin could be used green because the joints were designed to tighten as the wood dried. But furniture? Never. Furniture wood got stacked with stickers between every layer, stored under cover with good airflow, and left alone for at least a full year. Sometimes 2. In your shop, this means checking your moisture content before you start cutting joinery. Anything above 10% for interior furniture is asking for trouble 6 months down the road. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Old Ways, and it is a collection of 100 forgotten woodworking secrets from traditional craftsmen around the world. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The fourth rule is one that took me years to learn on my own, and the pioneers figured it out 200 years ago. Always orient your boards to fight the cup. When a flat board dries, it tends to cup away from the heart of the tree. The growth rings want to straighten out. Pioneer furniture makers knew this, and they used it. When they glued up a tabletop from multiple boards, they'd alternate the growth ring direction so that one board cupping up would be counteracted by the next board cupping down. The result was a top that stayed remarkably flat over decades. If you look at the underside of surviving pioneer tables, you can actually see this alternating pattern in the end grain. It's not random. It's deliberate engineering with no technology required, just an understanding of how wood behaves. The fifth rule surprised me when I first came across it. Cut your joints tight, not perfect. We tend to obsess over gap-free joinery in the modern shop. But pioneer craftsmen had a different standard. They wanted joints that were tight, meaning the fibers were compressed against each other with real friction and holding power. A joint that looked flawless but slid together easily was actually weaker than one that required a few firm mallet blows to seat. The compression of the wood fibers is what gives a joint its long-term strength. That blanket chest I found in Kentucky, the dovetails had tiny inconsistencies you could see if you looked closely, but every single one of them was tight. That's why it lasted almost 200 years. The sixth rule is simple and absolute. Never use a dull tool. On the frontier, a dull axe wasn't just inefficient, It was dangerous. A dull blade glances off the wood instead of biting in, and that's how people lost fingers or worse. Pioneer craftsmen sharpened obsessively. Every evening, tools got attention. A good craftsman could put a working edge on a chisel with nothing but a flat river stone and patience. In your shop, the same principle holds. A dull hand plane tears the grain. A dull chisel requires more force, which means less control. I made it a rule about 5 years ago to sharpen every edge tool before I start a project. Not when I notice it's getting dull, but before I even begin. That one habit has improved my work more than I can measure. The seventh rule is something I encountered in a journal entry from a Kentucky cabinet maker dated around 1820. Let the wood tell you what it wants to be. He wasn't being poetic. He was making a practical point. A board with a sweeping curve in the grain makes a terrible shelf rail, but a beautiful chair back. A piece of crotch walnut with wild figure is wasted on a drawer side where nobody will see it, but it's stunning as a tabletop panel. Pioneer craftsmen didn't have the luxury of ordering exactly what they wanted. They worked with what the forest gave them, and that forced them to really look at each piece and match it to the right purpose. It's a habit worth building, even when you have the luxury of choice. The eighth rule is about overbuilding, and the pioneers were unapologetic about it. Always build stronger than you think you need to. A three-legged stool that holds a 150-pound man needs to also survive being dragged across a puncheon floor, kicked by a child, and knocked over by a dog. So they made the legs from hickory, not pine. They used through tenons with wedges instead of simple dowels. They sized their stretchers a full inch thick when half an inch would have technically worked. In the modern shop, we tend to optimize for material savings and elegance. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want your work to still be solid in 50 years, build it like someone who expected it to survive 100. The ninth rule is about discipline. Finish what you start before you start something new. Pioneer workshops were small. Tools were shared. Materials were limited. You couldn't have 3 half-finished projects taking up space and tying up your only set of chisels. There was a practical economy to finishing one project completely before beginning the next. And honestly, this is a rule I still struggle with. But every time I follow it, my work is better. Focused attention over days produces better results than scattered attention over weeks. The 10th and final rule is one that says a lot about how these people thought about their craft. Take care of your tools before you take care of yourself. At the end of a long day of work, before you sat down to eat, you wiped down your saw blade, you oiled your plane iron, you hung your axe where it wouldn't get damp. Your tools were your livelihood. Replacing a broken chisel might mean a 60-mile trip to the nearest blacksmith. So tool care wasn't a chore. It was respect for the things that kept your family sheltered and fed. Now let me share some patterns I've noticed in modern shops, things I used to do myself that fly in the face of every one of these rules. The first pattern is reaching for the power tool before thinking about the wood. Most of us set up the table saw and start ripping before we've even looked at the grain orientation or checked for moisture. The pioneers couldn't do that because every step was manual, which forced them to evaluate before they acted. The second pattern is trusting the machine over your own eyes. We assume the thickness planer makes the board flat, the miter gauge makes the cut square, and the biscuit joiner makes the joint strong. But machines don't account for grain, direction, internal stress, or wood movement. The pioneers had to account for all of that with every single cut. The third pattern is building to minimum strength. We look up a joint online, see that it technically holds, and go with the smallest version that works. The pioneer approach was the opposite. If it can be stronger, make it stronger. The fourth pattern is neglecting tool maintenance until something goes wrong. Most of us sharpen when the tool stops cutting cleanly, not before. That's backwards, and the pioneers knew it. Once you start seeing these patterns in your own work, you can catch them, and that alone will make your projects better. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a grain reading trick I picked up from examining pioneer-era furniture, and I haven't seen it taught anywhere else. When those old craftsmen needed to determine which way to plane a board, they didn't just look at the edge grain. They'd wet the surface lightly with a damp rag, and then hold it at a low angle to a light source, like a window. The moisture raises the grain just enough to cast tiny shadows that reveal the fiber direction with absolute clarity. You can see exactly where the grain dives into the board and where it rises out. That tells you precisely which direction to push your plane for a tear-out-free surface. I started doing this about 3 years ago, and I haven't had a serious tear-out problem since. It takes about 15 seconds and a damp rag. That's it. The kind of quiet little trick that doesn't look like much, but changes your results permanently. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Old Ways. 100 techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with step-by-step photos and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one.